I think we are looking at a point deduction, I reckon, somewhere in the region of 60 to 100 points.
Hello and welcome back to Tear Us Apart, a podcast from England's footballing city. On this week's episode, we have an exclusive interview with football finance expert Kieran Maguire. So we'll get straight into it. Kieran, can you just sort of tell us about yourself and what you've done?
Well, I'm a teacher. I studied at the University of Manchester, so I'm a huge fan of the city. I lived in Manchester for 40 years. Because of the sports scene and the music scene, which is sort of my life. But I've been teaching myself since the 1980s in Manchester and Liverpool. And I've somehow managed to convince the people that run higher education that football finance is a proper subject. And on the back of that, I've managed to schlep a career as somebody that specialises in this. And it's become a much bigger topic than it has historically, certainly over the course of the last 10 years or so. The introduction of cost control rules, the big takeovers, the big numbers that are now involved in the game. So now on the back of that, I've been working with Whitehall. I was part of the fan-led review, been advising civil servants, ministers. I do around about 800 media slots a year. So today you are number 7 and it's 1:30 on a Wednesday afternoon. I've got a very good boss at the university who's very tolerant of me. So he says, provided I mention University of Liverpool, provided that appears on the radio and the television, it's free advertising. So he's very kind to me and allows me to disappear. At the same time, I'm a university lecturer. That is my priority. I've never missed a class. To be, for want of a better phrase, a media tart when I should be lecturing. So that's what it is. And on the back of that, I do a podcast with a stand-up comedian, which is bafflingly successful. I've got a best-selling book called The Price of Football, which is trying to demystify the finances of the game. And I'm just a teacher, but I've got a much higher profile than A, is necessary, and B, than is warranted as far as the football industry is concerned.
Perfect. Right. So we'll get straight into the questions. Obviously, it is a Manchester United, Manchester City podcast, so where better way to start than Manchester City's charges? What would you say your thoughts are on the charges, and do you think they will get away with it, per se?
The number 115 has now become part of folklore, which is rather bizarre because A, there's 130 charges, and B, actually there's only 3, and the 3 charges that are that Manchester City's owners have pumped money into the club, but disguised that as sponsorship income. Secondly, that Manchester City have been paying members of staff, but it's being paid through a third party. And the benefit is that's allowed Manchester City to artificially inflate the money coming in and artificially deflate the money that goes out. And given that the cost control rules, FFP, PSR, whatever you want to call them, are based on money in, less money out, that's good. If proven, then Manchester City is an advantage. The third accusation is that Manchester City have not cooperated with the Premier League, to which Manchester City's defence is the evidence that you have against us has been obtained through hacking our email systems, and therefore under such circumstances, why should we cooperate with you? So that's where we are today. But what I would say is that looking at the commission reports for Nottingham Forest and Everton football clubs, when they've both been charged by the Premier League, it's noticeable that the commission conclusion was that they were minor breaches. Now, they're minor breaches, and they resulted in a 4 points and a 6 point deduction. What Manchester City is being accused of, which is effectively corporate fraud, has to be constituted to be a major breach of the rules, and if guilty, and really has to stress the word if is really critical here. If guilty, the punishment is likely to be far harsher.
What do you think the punishment could be?
So it has to be a points deduction, I think, if found guilty of the first two sets of charges. For non-cooperation, a fine would probably be appropriate. If found guilty of the first, I think we are looking at a points deduction, I reckon, somewhere in the region of 60 to 100 points. I think the other thing that would happen is that the board of directors of Manchester City, they've effectively been proven to be liars and misrepresenting the state of the football club to the authorities. I don't see how they can keep their jobs. And certainly we saw in the case of Juventus, who have done something similar, that the whole board of directors had to resign.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and hopefully we get some insight into the result in the next couple of months, which we should do. So yeah, that'll be great. Just sort of an explainer question in terms of, I feel like amortisation is quite a topic that's going more and more in football currently, but it's kind of can be quite confusing to just the average football fan. Is there any way you can sort of explain that, like what it is and how it impacts football?
Yeah, amortisation is linked to player trading, player buying players and selling players. Put simply, if you sign a £50 million player on a 5-year contract, how are you going to show that as a cost to the club? And what amortisation says, well, £50 million, 5 years, it works out as £10 million a year. And that £10 million is treated as a cost when you do your PSR, FFP, whatever you want to call it, calculations. So the reason why it's a sensitive topic is that when you buy a football player, you spread the cost of the signing over, let's say, the 5 years of the player's contract. When you sell a player, you say that the player's value for PSR purposes is the original cost less the amortisation, but you take all of the profit in the year of sale. So there's a disconnect, there's a discontinuity between selling a player, and that's resulted in what we have seen in recent transfer markets, where clubs have been keen to sell players. Most clubs have got a financial year end of the 30th of June, and it's therefore that's the date which is used to assess their cost control rules. And that in June 2024, we saw in the final week of the season, Chelsea, Newcastle, Everton, Aston Villa, Leicester, Forest, all being involved in some fairly unusual transfers, which happened to involve players moving in opposite directions, but they were never a swap. Has to be. And many of those players were former academy players. And the reason why we have this is because you don't pay anything to get the registration of an academy player. Therefore, the cost is zero. Profit is sales price less cost. If your cost is zero, you sell a player and it's pure profit. There's no amortisation to worry about. But Conor Gallagher going from Chelsea, he was sold for 40 million. There was a profit of 40 million. When they sold Mason Mount to Manchester United, it was a sale price of 60 million and it was a profit of 60 million. And we've seen this with Anderson leaving Newcastle, with Dewsbury Hall leaving Leicester, and so on. So it's created a very strange set of circumstances in which young men are being used as commodities to dig football clubs out of points deductions.
I was literally just going to ask you about that, Kieran, because Manchester United in the January transfer window with both Mainu and Garnacho, there were reports coming out that they could have been sold because they are obviously from the academy and it would go down as pure profit. Now, with them being young talent and being sold, for making the case to sell them on to make more money, is that just not taking that's basically taking advantage of younger players who have got a lot of talent, isn't it, really?
It is. It's the commoditization of children. And I say, well, people hold them, they're earning lots of money, but these are teenagers. These are people who joined either Manchester United or Chelsea or City. It doesn't matter who the club is, who probably joined at the age of 6, 7, or 8 years of old because they were seen as having a precocious talent, and are now purely being used as inventory in order to dig the club out of making errors in recruitment elsewhere.
United have overspent for the last decade since Sir Alex Ferguson, David Gill left. But there's been quite a few bad owners in the Premier League. Who would you say are the top three worst? Do the Glazers make it, or is it Daniel Levy, FSG? Who would you say?
Daniel Levy's been a brilliant owner for the shareholders of Tottenham Hotspur Football Club. Tottenham Hotspur is the most successful business in the history of the Premier League. So if you say how do you define bad? And I think that as football fans, we have an investment in football, but it's an emotional investment. Now, I think you have to separate emotional investments from financial investments. The Glazers have done extremely well for the Glazers because they effectively bought a small stake in Manchester United for probably about 60 or 70 million pounds, and they sold a quarter of the club for 1.25 billion 12 months ago. Business deal, absolutely brilliant. The Glazers will also say, well, hold on, we're currently in the Europa League knockout phase, in the final phases of that. We've won 5 trophies in the last 10 years. How many other clubs can match that? We are currently if we win the Europa League, we're in the Champions League next season. Why are you picking on us? We've given managers unprecedented amounts of money to sell. So the fact that they've chosen to recruit players who are bobbins has nothing to do with us. So I think it's very difficult. FSG, Liverpool have just won the league phase of the Champions League, and I think it's fair to say that they are nailed on certainties to win the Premier League this season. So again, what have FSG done that is wrong? And I think we have to be just a little bit careful because there are supporters of probably 87, 88 clubs who would say 5 trophies in 10 years, I'd bite your hand off for that. Mm. So I don't really like to say that for me, the worst owners are the likes of Steve Dale, who before he did to Bury, he destroyed Bury Football Club, are the likes of Di Yonga at Reading, who hasn't paid wages on time. So the likes of Whittingham at Morecambe, because they're under a transfer embargo because they've not been paying the bills on time and so on. The Premier League owners, if their only crime is that the club is not winning trophies, then I think you can probably level that accusation at the vast majority of them. To say that one's worse than the other, what's Stan Kroenke ever done for Arsenal? When's he ever attended a match? So it's a really interesting and intriguing. And here, my job as an academic, I have to try to separate feelings as a football fan from object analysis as a financial person.
I think another main issue as well is for United fans is what's to come in the future as well, because the debt that's been loaded onto United financially wise, as well as 250 members of staff losing the job, also not being allowed to obviously spend as much as they'd obviously like to do. I think that's one of the main concerns, what the future looks like for Manchester United financially in the future, because you can see slowly Ineos are trying to get the debt down at the moment, and that is affecting the club both on and off the pitch.
Well, I put out a tweet yesterday which looked at the total spending by clubs in the 24-25 season. Manchester United are 3rd highest in the Premier League. So the money is there. The cultural changes which have been brought into Manchester United by the owners, I think that's a separate issue. Certainly from, I'm somebody who lived 40 years in Manchester. I've got mates who are stewards there. I've got mates who know people who know people. It's just like we all do. And they say morale has never been lower. And that's because people are actually saying, hold on, to you, Manchester United is a football team that you support. To them, it's a place of employment. And you don't, I can assure you, whenever you're under the threat of redundancy, whenever you're under the threat of your benefits being taken away, whenever you're under the threat of not knowing what's going to be happening next week, you've got a miserable place to work. And given that ultimately football is a people business, because that's why we go to watch them, if everybody in the organisation is miserable, that's going to be reflected on the pitch as well. So I think there are cultural issues. The debt is a fantastic stick with which to beat the Glazers, and I'm all for beating the Glazers. By the way, I've got no time for them, but actually the interest on those loans these days isn't significant because the loans have been rescheduled. The rates of interest that Manchester United were paying, they were paying 14.25%, 16.25%, and they were winning the Premier League and they were winning the Champions League when they had interest at those levels. Now they're paying at 3 and 4%. So, and their revenues have trebled, if not more, since the early days of the Glazers. So I think we have to be just a little bit careful that separation of emotion from business analysis is one which you can dislike the Glazers on an individual level, project big picture, Super League, and all of this type of stuff. Absolutely. But from a business point of view, it's not bad.
I'm conscious of time, so I'll ask you one more question. With the state of the wider footballing financial world, obviously we saw the European Super League, their attempts a few years ago. Do you think that will become inevitable that comes in to help the European clubs? Obviously, the Premier League can sort of live off its own, but do you think that it's sort of inevitable that it will become a thing or not?
It's not inevitable. Deloitte, the advisory company, put out the Deloitte Money League last week, and it was a Spanish club, Real Madrid, who were top of the Money League. It wasn't a team from the Premier League. So there's no reason why the Super League, because there's nothing super about Super League, by the way. It's just it's just a name that they've arrogantly given to themselves. And it's noticed that it's populated by cowards as well. Not a single Super League owner, when on the night that it was announced, because I was working for the media that night. Not a single person from Manchester United, Arsenal, Liverpool, Spurs were willing to come and talk and explain exactly what they were doing and why they were doing it and why they were trying to steal football for their own. So from a business point of view, I'll be honest, Super League's a fantastic product. Guaranteed revenues, de-risk. You can have wage caps, which will be far lower than they are at present, and the players will know nowhere else to go. So that means even more money for the billionaires who currently own clubs. But as a product, as a football fan who has aspirations, as someone that goes home and away to watch my own team, it's an absolutely terrible product.
Well, that was a very, very insightful interview from Kieran Maguire there. That was really fascinating and gave us a proper different perspective on football than us fans sort of always see. But that is all for this week's episode of Tear Us Apart. Check us out on all our socials on Spotify, Twitter, YouTube, Instagram. Give us a follow, give us a like, and we'll be back next week, most likely, for another episode. Goodbye.